Welcome to this special program, Speed to Mission, Accelerate GenAI Adoption Through Procurement Innovation, sponsored by AWS Marketplace. FedGov Today recorded these conversations at AWS Reinvent in Las Vegas. I'm your host, Francis Rose. Government and industry leaders say generative artificial intelligence has the potential to revolutionize national security, military, and civilian operations. One challenge agency leaders have found is how to procure GenAI solutions. On this program, you'll learn about the ways agencies are acquiring, testing, and scaling GenAI solutions from government and industry leaders. The speed at which the GenAI movement is growing across government is complicating the acquisition process. David Appel is Vice President for Federal at AWS. When I ask him how agencies should approach AI, he tells me his answer has changed over the last year or so.
A year ago, when GenAI started, I think it was, no one was sure what to do with it. It was the new buzzword, and there were some initial prototyping and proofs of concepts. But what we're really seeing now, agencies lean in a little bit further and really see how can we get to production workloads faster. They're starting to see the benefits of the efficiencies they can drive, allowing humans to focus on the value add that a human can make a decision or get to true insights. But the overall cultural change of adopting the technology has really started to pick up pace in the recent months.
The human value add, I think, is really an important element to highlight because that's the message that agencies have been trying to send to their employees. This is not going to replace you, not just now, but at no point in the future is that the goal of the agency, to replace the human with the technology. Why has that maybe been a tougher nut to crack than they think?
I think it's maybe just it's change. It's human nature. It's change. But there's so much mundane things that have to happen, whether it's in the intel community or Department of Defense, the data ingestion and sorting through the data and trying to make sense of data. A lot of that a computer can do, or the GenAI can do. What you really want the human to focus on is on the higher end, what decisions do I want to make now? Not let the computer make the decisions for you or automatically do something, but allow the human to make the right decisions and provide better courses of action to maybe make decisions. And that's where I think we'll start to see real benefits on both mission outcomes, but also time and energy and space to allow humans to focus on those higher end areas.
The term mission outcomes reminds me that the leaders that I talk to all across government, this might be the first technology in the 2 decades or so that I've been covering the government where people have focused on mission outcomes instead of, I want to get some, whatever the new technology is, and then figure out a way to use it. What do you think's driving that, and what's the benefit that the government will realize by thinking about mission outcomes as opposed to technology implementation?
Well, I think because of the overall just pace of change with technology, and there's data overload. Certainly in various parts of the government, there's new sensors being put up, whether it's a weather sensor or it's an intelligence sensor, and the pace of that is there's not enough humans to handle all of that. And so I think there's some more acceptance to that regard. And as technology continues to change and people get more comfortable with it, I think it's opening up the doors more.
How are you seeing the effective collaboration between government and industry work? What are the components of that as GenAI really takes hold in cross?
Well, I think that it comes in various areas. First of all, the technology is coming out of industry and the non-traditional areas of the industrial base for the government, and so there's a collaboration that has to happen on culture, on training, on ways to adopt the technology, and also how to show how it can actually provide that mission outcome through proofs of concepts or other aspects. At AWS, we're excited to have that. We have a large ecosystem of partners that we utilize that bring mission knowledge to some of our customers as well, and then we help them with various incentives to get them to help adopt the technologies faster. In June of this year at our DC summit, we announced a $50 million incentive in our public sector to help organizations adopt GenAI faster through promotional credits, through training, through technical services to help understand the technology and solve real world problems.
What can government do to be a better partner in that collaboration? What can you and other industry people do to be a better partner in that collaboration?
From a government perspective, the government by nature is risk adverse, and rightfully so. And I think what on the government side, and we're seeing it now, is better leadership and saying we need to move in this area. We need to break through the frozen middle, and that is occurring. But it does take time. And then on the industrial base side, is we need to realize that the world is changing, the technology is changing, the way all of us have done business for the last 10, 20, 30 years is not necessarily how we're going to do business in the future. So we have to adopt that change and take advantage of the programs that we have to help incentivize to accelerate that change. Our marketplace program and our IC marketplace program is a great example of where we now have the ability for the government to quickly access these companies and our SaaS providers to quickly utilize the GenAI or other technologies versus having to go through the long procurement processes because it's already in place. So there are ways to do this and do it fast.
We have about a minute left, and the future is where I want to finish up. What do you see over the horizon that government people should be paying attention to now regarding GenAI that will impact them in 12, 24, 36 months? Is there even a way to predict it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a crystal ball. But I think the way I'd answer that is we're just scratching the surface right now. And realize this is the future. And I think if we start with just accepting it as the future and diving in, the possibilities of the next 12, 24, 36 months are really limitless. And for the types of things that our government does to improving citizens' experience, to improving our national security, GenAI and these technologies are going to be critical to our future, and we need to figure out how to embrace them.
David Appel of AWS. The speed of change I mentioned a moment ago appears to be the nature of things for GenAI for the foreseeable future. Master Sergeant Will Haskell is a senior technical program manager for the Space Force. I asked him what he sees coming for federal leaders in the next year or so.
I think, frankly, we're going to see quite a bit of rapid innovation in the next year or so, specifically in the classified regions, with the announcement of Bedrock being available to the intelligence community and the DoD in the top secret regions. Having access to serverless large language model inference like that is really kind of game changing. I run a program currently where as soon as we have access to it, we're going to switch from running our own inference on P4D instances, which are very expensive, to hitting those Bedrock endpoint, those Bedrock API endpoints, which will save us tens of thousands, if not more, dollars per month on our cloud consumption, as well as giving us access to some frontier models, specifically Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which is immensely capable, to say the least. So I would expect some really cool agentic workflows, and frankly, there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that that personally I would like to get after, but I gotta focus on the current effort at hand before I get to that.
What are some of the examples of what's out there that you and your colleagues across the community might be able to leverage pretty quickly?
So, for example, I run a program called Guru, or Generative Unified Retrieval Utility, that's kind of aimed at providing almost like a Bing Copilot or Perplexity AI like capability for the intelligence community. Right? We have a billion different data silos out there, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons. But unless you know, as an analyst or a user on high side, unless you know where that data is or where that tool is, you're not going to find it. It's like trying to search on the dark web, right? So enabling folks to query a federated answer engine really, they can ask a precise question, get a precise answer, and get pointed to that source system without having to hear about it through word of mouth, or stumble upon it via our current outdated and not very useful search and data discovery applications that we have available to us.
How do you evaluate potential solutions, and how do you like to see your peers evaluate solutions to be able to get them into production and implementation as quickly as possible?
So, like from the commercial side you're talking about, not being a cybersecurity guy, a lot of times obviously they have to meet certain cybersecurity requirements.
Yes.
Luckily, I'm not involved in that process. I have many smart people on both the government side as well as the commercial side who do all of that work. For me personally, it's more about the performance and the use cases of the technology. But in order for me to get to play around with it in my region, it has to go through either some kind of cybersecurity standards.
You mentioned use cases, and what is striking to me about all of the conversations I've had here, both with government and industry people, is the government side, especially I think in NatSec and IC, has done a good job of aligning use cases to the technology instead of the technology to use cases. What do you think is driving that?
I think probably this technology is so, specifically generative AI, it's such a large leap and kind of so ubiquitous that everybody plays with ChatGPT. Everybody is kind of subconsciously developing these prompt engineering skills, whether they know it or not. And those use cases kind of just make their way into your brain, right? I'm not a program manager by trade. I'm not a software developer by trade. I'm an Intel analyst. So as soon as I saw ChatGPT back in 2022, immediately this would be incredible to use inside the SCIF for a bunch of different use cases.
What's the challenge been, if any, in getting the data either prepared or into a SCIF that you can use it, whether it's proprietary data, whether it's open source data, whatever?
So like as far as leveraging open source models, things like that, really the only problem that we've ran into, or I've ran into personally, is a lot of the some of the models have specific language in their end user agreements. For example, Meta's models strictly prohibit espionage or military use cases with the models. That's now changed, although I don't know exactly how, because it still says that in the EULA. But I know there's been announcements in the news saying that they are providing the models via industry partners, which I think is an awesome step for us. The other thing on certain leading models, particularly like dense embedders, the really good open source ones, unfortunately, are made in China. So we stay as far away from those as possible. But again, with Bedrock coming to region, I'm excited to play with Titan text embeddings and a couple other things. I'm hoping right now I believe it's just Claude 3.5 and Titan text embeddings, at least initially. I was real excited to hear about the Nova family models. Looked up the tokens in, tokens out pricing almost immediately, and I was shocked at how inexpensive those are. So I've already started playing with those low side, hoping they make their way into the region as well.
Master Sergeant Will Haskell of the Space Force. Federal leaders are juggling a lot of different factors as they test and then scale AI solutions. Industry leaders tell them to learn and then stick to the fundamentals. Mamie Cruse is Vice President of Partnerships at Second Front Systems. She tells me one factor will drive AI success for agencies.
The speed that they're able to get their hands on the data and get it connected to the models will be key. And we're already doing this with a number of AI companies, bringing them into the high side and getting them to their mission owner, and already seeing them start to win and have reduced times, have huge impacts on their kind of end mission by quickly being able to access them and feed them the data that lives in those environments.
One of the things that agencies, I think, are getting better at is applying agile technology principles. One of them is small wins. It sounds like that's important in this area too.
Absolutely, yeah. And it starts with getting them there, right? Until they're there, all the kind of shininess of what's happening on the commercial side, they really can't start to benefit until they get over that bridge into those accredited environments. So getting them there is kind of the first big victory, and then getting them access to these data and letting their models learn, it's like the sky's the limit, really.
It sounds like you occupy an interesting space too, because government people and industry people that I talk to always talk about industry-government collaboration. It sounds like you sit in kind of an interesting fulcrum in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in not just Second Front, but in my role in partnerships, I get to work with, people like AWS, companies like AWS, and AWS in particular, where we're focused on this kind of accreditation challenge and the removing that barrier of accreditation. By partnering with AWS on the marketplace side, they're focused on that procurement challenge. Those are two of the big barriers for commercial tech to get to public sector. So, things like the ICMP, the intelligence community marketplace, have been complete game changers for our customers that are trying to reach those mission owners. So, we help get them accredited and bring them there, but the marketplace, the ICMP, makes it optional, creates the optionality for that mission owner to quickly procure that and get their hands on it in lightning speed. So I've been part of that process and seen that firsthand for our customers, and it's so exciting, and it's all building on AWS's marketplace, kind of core marketplace, which is really second to none.
Mm-hmm. We just have a little bit of time left, Mamie. What's the biggest barrier? Is that speed and that accreditation process, acquisition and so on, the biggest barrier that you're seeing, or are there others that will need to move along before this maximum potential can be realized?
Yeah, I think the accreditation barrier is the biggest one that we see, and part of that is probably because of where we sit. We are talking to customers about that all day, every day. But being able to, it's not the only barrier. So being able to partner and solve those other barriers like the procurement challenge and bring that holistically together just helps accelerate things all the more.
Final thought, about a minute left. What do you think the future looks like a year from now, 2 years out in this space, in not just the areas that you talked about necessarily, but more broadly?
Yeah, I think that we'll really be in a position if we can remove these barriers and let this amazing commercial, like these models that exist in the commercial space, let them in on the high side and let them start learning. I think that we'll start to have really amazing wins as a country, and that'll really position us to be at the forefront. And I think that's what's most exciting about this, is that unlocking this and kind of solving for this really helps position us as a country to be a leader.
And that could lead to exponential growth too, and not just linear growth in the number and success of the projects. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Mamie Cruse of Second Front Systems. Agencies continue to detail the use cases they're pursuing with GenAI. Some agencies are getting further than others in that effort. Drew Furman is Vice President of Enterprise Strategy at Pluralsight. He says there's a gap between agency aspiration and accomplishment with the cloud and AI.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to do AI without cloud computing, right? And so there's this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How do you establish the foundations of cloud computing with ephemeral workloads, infrastructure as code, some of really the basic building blocks. And then from there, have a modern data strategy if you can do those things, then AI really becomes a evolution instead of a revolution. But trying to jump into AI straight away, you're going to have issues. And it's like, I think 90% of all AI projects are stalled in the prototype phases and unable to get to production because people are realizing they need to kind of go back to the basics. So yeah, and a lot of that is, we're on a mission to teach the world of cloud with Pluralsight, and skills is a big part of that, right? You have to have the skills to be able to build the foundational building blocks of cloud computing, and then, move forward to leverage AI.
The federal government embarked on its cloud journey as an enterprise, I want to say in the 2010, 2011 timeframe. What still remains to be done in order to get to where the agencies say they want to go on AI?
Well, so one of the things I've learned from my experience in an enterprise for a long time and helping to build a cloud program is there's a lot of inertia within enterprises, certainly a lot of inertia within federal agencies, the as is. And to overcome that inertia, you need a significant amount of momentum. I call that critical mass, right, to overcome that. And specifically, you need that critical mass with cloud literacy and fluency. If you end up having a cloud center of excellence or a program office that, you're in an echo chamber of folks that know how to speak cloud, but you don't really need just the SEAL Team 6, right? You need infantry. So, because SEAL Team 6, once they build something, they want to move forward, and then you have porous defenses. And in cloud, that means security vulnerabilities, right? So you need infantry and you need critical mass of that. So I spent a lot of time helping to build critical mass of cloud fluency at scale. And that's really the only way you can create this sustainable transition to the new operating model. And many enterprises, and certainly the agencies, are still struggling with how to build those, that literacy and build that culture of cloud computing.
At the risk of setting myself up for an "it depends" answer, where are agencies in that journey right now? Are they doing well? Are they doing not so well? And whichever reason, what are the factors behind how they're doing?
It's interesting, and it probably mirrors a little bit of what we're seeing in the private sector as well, that you have the have and the have-nots. Right. So I think you have even some departments within agencies, and certainly some agencies that have embraced it, that have leaders that are willing to take some risk and invest in not only their talent, but invest in solutions to be able to deliver on their mission. Right. And you're seeing, once you start creating that flywheel, that momentum, you really start to accelerate and pull away. And that gap is getting wider and wider from those agencies that are really, truly embracing it. And some of them are speaking at AWS Reinvent, they're on stage. But, I think that that's a relatively small minority of unicorns that are out there. I would probably say, I think it's 85% of all IT spend is still on-prem. So I think that's a pretty good indicator of where we are from our maturity. So I would probably say we're still in the tactical stages, maybe emerging in some ways to be a little bit more strategic, but certainly not at that transformational stage yet.
What will help organizations break out? Is it Congress giving them money to do these things? Is it somebody in leadership within the agency saying we have to break the traditions that we have established, or some other factor, do you think?
There certainly is a lot of focus in Washington these days on operational efficiency, right? And I think there's a pretty obvious emerging use case for how to apply AI, specifically agent autonomous AI, to be able to start streamlining a lot of these very intensive, resource heavy workflows, right? So there's a use case for that right now. AWS is investing really heavily in these solutions, right, to enable that. We're investing heavily in providing the skills to people to use them. There's still a pretty significant gap between intent and execution. One of the biggest gaps is the procurement process, right? So it's like, yeah, you can go ahead and provide agencies these funds, but in my experience, innovation tends to die in the hands of legal and procurement, right? And people need to be spending, more time innovating, less time procurement. I think it's roughly 300 days that federal agencies are spending simply on procuring software. That's a pretty big waste of time. So, things like the AWS marketplace with frictionless procurement, You could subscribe, and purchase, deploy in a matter of days. Those are the types of things that agencies should be exploring to be able to get innovative solutions and skills development like Pluralsight in the hands of their workforce. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how much funds you have if you can't unlock them and start accessing new tools and services.
Kunal Sharma, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining me today. What are you seeing agencies across the federal government doing with generative AI now? How are they approaching it, and how are they thinking about what they're using it for? And then how are they actually taking that to execution, to implementation?
This is an interesting question. It's an exciting time for the federal government. We now have the question of, are models available? What are the appropriate security and compliance considerations that need to be taken? What are the most compelling use cases? And then, how does that relate to the other priorities that were already going on across the federal government? I think the first thing that we're seeing is agencies and leaders determining how to balance speed and responsibility in adopting generative AI. And so as a part of that, they look at the way to leverage this technology in a secure cloud environment through accredited services, and to use models that they can rely on from a trust and safety standpoint and a reliability and performance standpoint. So I think the first agencies are looking at that step. And the second thing that we're seeing is the beginnings of determining different buckets of use cases. And high level, right? There's some general purpose that sometimes is described as back office, otherwise described as general purpose interaction with documents. And that's kind of one bucket that we're seeing as really promising. And then there's a second bucket, which is where customers have existing programs and missions, and they're curious on how to weave in the power of these models into those software platforms that they have today. Mm-hmm. And so those are more tailored to a specific purpose, and we're seeing the government look at this on these two levels in these early days.
How are you seeing agencies evaluate those different buckets, and how should they maybe evaluate them differently than what you're seeing, if so?
So I think the first part is the time to value is something that we see a significant interest in. I think the government, several leaders across, are interested to get things across the line when possible. So the first item for evaluation is, where are models available, on which networks, which environments? The second criterion is, are these occurring through accredited services, cloud environments that the government can rely on? And then the third is, what are the performance and reliability characteristics of the models, and can they turn to these? So they're looking at some of these criteria. Across these two buckets for general purpose use cases, the federal government is understanding the right way to set up reusable components that they can help streamline within their agencies. And I think that's going well. It's obviously still early days. And on the second part, I think when they're thinking about how to deploy this into existing programs, they're looking for software platforms that they're currently using, partners that they currently use, could be systems integrators, that they trust to take them to the next step when it comes to employing this new technology. And so this is the way that we see things evolving.
And that evolution, does that extrapolate itself out 2 years from now, 3 years from now, in your view? Is that the trajectory that you continue to see, or is it possible this could bend in some other direction that we don't anticipate today?
So it's a great question. I think there's significant momentum recently from the government and also from industry, from academia, on increasing the pace of collaboration. So assuming this continues, right, assuming that government and industry can continue to collaborate effectively, there's significant room for growth over the next 2 years. There's obviously, was recently a national security memorandum relating to generative AI. Separately from that, there have been prior initiatives as well. And so assuming that we can continue to make progress, I think there's a large opportunity and a high probability of success where we're going to see unlocking productivity across the federal government, allowing them to do more with less in a more efficient manner. And then B, increasing the education of the workforce and how to use this. And then C, we're going to see the government start to put forward its positions on how it wants to adopt this larger scale for specific mission sets. And I think that we can see a lot of progress in the next 2 years.
I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of the conversation, and you talked about balancing speed and responsibility. Is there an effective metric to be able to gauge whether you're doing that right, or is it art rather than science? You know it when you see it.
I think it's an interesting question. There are some concepts that are reasonable to apply here. Speed to mission, right? How can we, think about speed to mission? The ability to find your partner that you want to implement with, right? The ability to complete the transaction process to support speed to mission is something that we can measure, and there are mechanisms like AWS Marketplace, for example, that accelerate that, and we can count and say, we saved this much time in a process that otherwise would have delayed adding value to the mission. So that's one thing we can look at. When it comes to responsibility, there are other metrics as well. So whether the services that we're using these models for carry relevant FedRAMP accreditations, DoD, SRG accreditations, that's basically a binary. Is it true or not at a certain period in time? Does that cover where we're going? And I think the last part is also another metric that's useful is the level of pilots and adoption to understand, by the government to understand the value for a specific set. So that's, a little bit difficult to quantify, but the idea of doing that and including that as a part of your process helps increase the speed responsibility decision calculus.
Kunal Sharma of Anthropic. Earlier in the program, I mentioned use cases that agencies are pursuing with GenAI. At some agencies, those use cases number in the hundreds. Ravi Raghava is Chief Technology Officer for the Civilian Business Group at SAIC. He says the federal government's uptake on generative AI is revolutionary.
So we are seeing rapid adoption of AI across the industry, and there are several use cases that we can talk about. Primarily from a public sector and government perspective, I see the adoption in enhancing citizen experience. For example, generative AI can essentially be used to process claims, benefits, records management, all of this at a very accelerated pace. And we are seeing significant traction in that space. And another area where I do believe that this is going to, over the next 2-3 years, we will see increased adoption of generative AI in application development, software development lifecycle, coding, it's going to be accelerated using generative AI, and unit testing, deployments. All these are essentially going to drive efficiencies because we see automation using generative AI.
One of the themes that we're hearing about as we're at this conference, this event, is balancing speed and responsibility. Agencies talk all the time about responsible use of AI. It's almost like it's part of the title, the way that they're using the terminology now. What's the right way to achieve that balance of getting the work done, getting these prototypes in some cases into production and so on, but also doing it in a responsible way?
A great question, actually. So the pace at which the evolution is happening and the acceleration of services and offerings that are being offered to the industry is significant. And I do see the challenge. There are some challenges naturally, because from the government perspective, so the government should put public interest as a priority, and security, and then ethics. So these are kind of three core elements that are kind of very important. And from a policy perspective, government needs to establish frameworks, ethical standards, which would essentially include efficacy, fairness, any unintended bias, and all that, right? So these are some of the challenges. And from a procurement standpoint, so typically, our procurement cycles are fairly long. So ideal thing would be to have short impact, modular contracting options, wherein industry can essentially make use of those. For example, Other transaction authorities, the OTAs, are a great way to do this short stint, wherein, we can try this out. So that will be a quick win, both for the industry as well as for the government. And also adding on to that, you can look at challenge-based acquisitions and solicitations. Those are extremely good way to kind of test few of the offerings to see if that is essentially going to work for you. And in that way, like, you are able to choose the best of the best in a shorter time frame instead of waiting for the longer procurement cycles.
Is it encouraging maybe that the agencies are saying the same thing in as far as being able to speed up the acquisition process, that maybe there'll be a push from industry, push from government too? Because I just had a CIO tell me recently, I'd really like to just be able to try this stuff out in a very short period of time. And by the time I get to actually be able to use it, it's kind of been overcome by events, whatever the technology may be.
No, you are absolutely spot on. I think we are seeing it both from the government as well as from the industry. I think having very agile procurement processes in this space is essentially going to help the government, because by the time the actual traditional cycles are essentially complete, there are several new offerings and services that are already out in the market, and the government should essentially be leading it, trying to take advantage of it. Some barriers that I do see outside of procurement are limited availability of trained resources in artificial intelligence, right? So both from the industry as well as that. I think government needs to upskill the force, invest in talent acquisition, collaborate and partner with the industry. In that way, like, they can bridge the gap that we see.
We have just over a minute left. Have you seen anybody yet, and you can name them or not, but has anybody in your view cracked the code on any of those challenges that you've talked about so far? The upskilling folks, then preparing the talent, or speeding the acquisition process, any of that?
Absolutely. So there are agencies like the GSA and NASA, they are kind of adopting those approaches. And we are seeing agencies, adopt more of such procurements wherein they are able to put those into use. I would also like to appreciate the industry as well. We work with all the hyperscalers and technology partners, AWS being one of the great partners that we have. So we collaborate with them actively to co-build solutions and services that can essentially accelerate the modernization and bring in AI services to drive more efficiencies with the government.
Ravi Raghava of SAIC. Many of the use cases I talked about a moment ago are in the pilot stage. The challenge some agencies are finding is moving from pilot to production. John Benders, Regional Vice President for Federal for Neo4j, he tells me that change is normal.
I don't think it's anything but the natural process. At the end of the day, what's going on here is the government's trying to figure out how to use GenAI. There's a lot of use cases. It could be as simple as trying to understand, process documentation, and it could be it could be the Congress looking at, different laws or positions and trying to understand and using GenAI to better understand the volume of work, if you will, and get a better understanding of what's going on. That's a very useful GenAI example to help, automate that and be smart about it. The other ones then, the harder ones, are when it becomes valuable, like helping a citizen make a decision. Those are great, applications, but there's risk in there. What if they're wrong? Mm-hmm. What happens if the decision is improper? What if the AI returns the wrong decision, the wrong guidance? That's the issue, right? So a lot of these are unwilling to come out of pilot phase because they're still getting errors. The GenAI will, if you're familiar with what's going on in the back end with LLMs and what have you, they're doing word associations and proximities and calculating what words go together. It's not based on facts. Mm. So a lot of the pilots right now are not using anything but that type of information. They're using vectors, which makes it better. And don't get me wrong, I think the GenAI and the LLMs are doing fantastic things. I use the term automagical sometimes because I'm not sure how they got the response, but they were right. Mm. It's fabulous. But they're still missing facts. And that's where, the next stage is going to be the graph, right? Or what's being coined as the knowledge graph now, right? And then there's the graph RAG, which is the retrieval augmented generation aspect of using the graph, because what the graph deals with is facts. It's symbolic in a sense, right? It's using people, places, things, and it's using connections and relationships between them. So we're an organization that just uses an LLM and maybe some of their vector work. Okay, it doesn't know anything about your business though, right? And that's the thing. It's like it's having the best business consultant out there that knows nothing about your business, which is problematic for trying to answer real life problems or citizen facing things or even internal facing decisions. You know, what if they're trying to figure out an HR question that could mean the difference between hiring and firing? You really want to base that off of data that's not internal? And that's the challenge, right? Yeah. So you got to be careful. So that's where the graph comes in. So now you start to put the facts of your business into the graph. And it can handle vectors as well, so it can be structured and unstructured, a mix of both. And then what happens is now the GenAI has that extra data, so it comes through the graph RAG, then basically gets a subset of information. So when the question is asked, the GenAI will do a fabulous job of translating it into cipher codes, moving that through and getting it back into the LLM. So basically what you're doing is you're saying, here's your general question, but I'm giving you more facts about my business to help you form the right answer or more accurate. And what they found is using GraphRag is you get about a 3x increase in correctness, in validity. What they're finding, plus in a lot of cases, it's almost 20, I think they said it's 28% faster, which is impressive, right? So if you're three times more accurate and faster, that's the next phase, right? That's where they're going to head. So, the first journey is correct, get in there, get piloting and understand, but now you got to understand the risk of not going further, right? And it's risky if you don't, because, in the public sector, the private sector, it's money, it's loss, it's shareholder values, it's all these other things. It could be in the government, it could be, someone in the VA trying to get help and trying to figure out how to do it and getting the wrong answers. That's not acceptable.
Who has to do what to move agencies to the next level? Are there things that they can do internally? Are they reliant on industry? Is there a collaboration piece? What does that look like in a 12 to 24 month time window?
So what they're saying, so Gartner is saying now that in 2025, 50% of all Gen Is will include the knowledge graph. So it's coming. It's the next, what's happening. In most of the AI, call it the AI practitioners now, the leaders in AI, they're all going to the knowledge graph now too, because it's a progression. It's not replacing anything out of the Gen AI, it's adding more value. So that's where everything's heading. So the government's going to get there. It's just a matter of, of giving them time. And part of it's the process. Government is methodical, is the term I will use, in how they approach and process, right? And part of the, people don't realize that the procurement process in the government is part of their readiness. It's part of how their force structure is procurement's a big piece of that. So any way that they can optimize their procurement, we use Amazon a lot. We use the marketplace because the marketplace is a great place we have found in the last year for making procurements go more smoothly with the government, because they don't have to have multiple procurements to pick up the technology now. So that's one of the ways we've helped them accelerate in getting into the graphs and the knowledge graphs.
John Bender of Neo4j. One factor of Gen AI proliferation we haven't talked about so far is risk. AI leaders in government and industry are applying risk management tools to their execution and acquisition. Jeff Jones is head of revenue for the Americas for Poolside.ai. He says the first thing to think about in that area is how the tools were created.
What is the data that went into those models? Where did the data come from? How is that data licensed? Then when you take those models and you take them on a mission or to an organization or to an agency, how do you want to deploy that? Is it required to be air-gapped? Should it go in a VPC? Should it be on-prem? What type of accreditations do you need in order for it to be successful for that as well? And then there's the end use case. What you're trying to do is make engineers more productive, because we're focused on software development with our Gen AI solutions. And by doing that, how are they interacting with the models? What type of information are they putting into it? Is it secure? Where is that information going? And what kind of data is coming out from that as well? I was talking to an agency, in fact, this week, and we got this question. So it's an interesting question. It said, Jeff, how do you know when you get a recommendation from a model, how do you know where it came from? like, can you trace it back to the exact place where it came from? And I think it's important to step back and think about, like, this is based on a neural network. So think of like the human brain. It's really hard to see or determine where an exact point of information came from. So a friend of mine gave me this analogy. Like, imagine I'm a tomato farmer and you bought some tomatoes from me and you really like my tomatoes, but you said, I want to know the exact place on the farm where those tomatoes came from. And I don't know the exact place where those tomatoes came from. We don't have GPS on our tomatoes, but really I need to figure out why you're asking that question. And the reason you're really asking that question is you want to know, is there pesticides in these tomatoes or any kind of chemicals? And I can guarantee that there's no pesticides or chemicals because I know what's happening in the soil. It's the same thing with LLMs. As long as you know where the source data is coming from and it's properly licensed, you can have confidence.
What are the agencies doing well, and what are they having a harder time with, in your view, to understand all of the components of what you just described?
I mean, I think the first thing is being able to deploy it in an area that they feel comfortable in. And so that's the first thing, because there's not a lot of options out there. The second piece is just trying to understand what you want to do with it and what your use cases are before maybe getting mired in all the security and compliance type questions, and then fitting to that as you go through the implementation. I think the other piece that's important, take technology out of it. It's the change management. You're changing how agencies and missions and like they're interacting on a day-to-day basis. So it's the incentives you're creating and the change management and just training of team members in order to use the platform and the tools in that regard.
A lot of government entities are starting their AI journeys, Gen AI journeys, by using their own data and not using stuff from outside their own four walls. Is that good? Is that good to a point? Is that maybe not as helpful as it could be, or neutral?
I think using your own data is great. I think using your own data in combination with some of the most powerful LLMs out there is an even better combination, as long as you know that those models that you're working with are correct in the different type of compliance and how they were built and generated and where they're deployed. So using your own data on a mission is really important, because then you have the context of the code bases and the software development lifecycle and how you work. So that's a really important facet when going forward with these types of implementations.
For decades that I've been in this space, government technology leaders have said, I don't really have time to figure out what's over the horizon because I'm drinking from the fire hose of what I have to deal with today. That's really become accelerated with Gen AI because of the unpredictability. I mean, it kind of showed up on the landscape for people 12 to 24 months ago. What do you tell folks that are trying to understand what may be coming, maybe not available to them today, technology-wise, data management-wise, any of those factors, and they're trying to figure out, what do I at least need to keep my eye on for the future?
It's a really good question, and it's good that we're becoming more forward-thinking, but it's also important, I guess, to kind of answer that in a different way, for us to set reality of what you can do. I think people get really excited about AI and they think it can solve everything, and we're just not there yet. And so it's important to know what you're trying to do with your exact requirements and use cases and work to that. Because where we are right now in Gen AI and software development, it's really about code assistance. It's about human in the loop, which I think is really valuable to your first question around compliance and security. So humans always involved. But what we want to do is we want to improve that for the future. And what a lot of organizations and agencies are asking us for is really agentic type services. And so it's where you can take some of the burden off of software engineers and maybe some of the synchronous tasks and help them where they could like press a button and then 3 or 4 hours later, many different tasks could happen. It could be on the modernization of code or refactoring of code, but then it goes through security scans and integration scans. And then it comes back for review. And so to take that burden off, but we're not there yet. And I think there's a big reason why we're not there yet. Today, there's only a certain amount of data that can be used to train these models. So there's about 20 trillion tokens of useful web data, 3 trillion tokens of code data, but it's growing fast, but not fast enough to make these models much more intelligent to get to those agentic tasks. So we need to come up with ways as model providers to create synthetic data and do it in a safe and genuine manner. And by creating that synthetic data, we can get past this data hurdle, data void, to make these models more intelligent by feeding them this information.
Jeff Jones of Poolside.ai. Thanks for watching this special program, Speed to Mission, Accelerate GenAI Adoption Through Procurement Innovation, sponsored by AWS Marketplace. If you missed any part of this show, you can watch it on demand anytime at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks for watching.